Well, yeah, I think you've hit it spot on. My dad, when he was asked by someone interviewing him the other day, they said, "What's your advice?" She was a young ecologist, and he said, "My advice is to be a scientist first and an academic second."
Yes.
And he said, "We've lost the art of being curious and trying to figure things out. You know, we just get told." And my dad actually left university. He just said, I couldn't learn true science in university. I was just being fed the dogma of society.
Exactly.
So he went out and learned, like, and observed for himself, which I think has made him such an incredible scientist. And people always say to me, "Oh, but you could have, you know, really done well and gone to university." I said, I didn't want to, because I could learn much more by experience and doing in many different aspects of my life. I didn't want to narrow my field. Sure, if you want to be a surgeon or something very specific, then of course, like, what you do is just incredible, and you could not have a PhD for what you do. You know what I mean? But when you're dealing with complex natural systems out in nature, I think you've got to be curious. And the original scientists were just farmers that experimented with plants, and I think, I can't remember the figures, but out of like 6 different types of vegetables or weeds, they came up with everything that we have today. And that wasn't scientists that had gone through university, that was people observing the land. So that, I think that's what we need to get back to in agriculture, is people with a genuine knowledge of the land, like itself. I feel very much like, I mean, my dad taught me a lot of stuff. Obviously, I pick up his book and I read his book, and I'm like, I don't learn this from a book. I learn this from being out on the land, being with the herders, being with communities, training, teaching. And you guys are teaching me so much. I can't believe, since we started these conversations, how much I'm learning, because it challenges me to simplify, it challenges me to say things different. You give me a different take, because I think I get stale, and, you know, like, so it just inspires and teaches, and it's communicating, and I don't think you ever stop learning, you know. So it's really nice.
Yeah.
The 1840s, and that has to do with what we're doing right now with the coronavirus. Is now the science of the virus is that we have to maintain social distance, we have to cover our faces. I've got my, you know, mask here and stuff, and we have to wash our hands. Well, science hasn't always been that smart. In the 1840s, at the Vienna General Hospital, there was high mortality of women giving birth due to infections of the reproductive tract. And Inges Semmelweis made the impolitic observation that the training room for the doctors had as many as 1 out of 3 women dying from complications. And the other ward was being operated by midwives, and they had no deaths at all going on there. And so the big difference was that the doctors would go from performing autopsies on corpses to patients giving birth without washing their hands, and they were proud about all the blood stains on their jackets and stuff. And so Semmelweis, he insisted that doctors change their coats and wash their hands before seeing living patients. And the mortality went down by 90% in the ward staffed by doctors, until it about matched what the midwives were doing. And so this was a great success, except the medical community was furious, and they fired Semmelweis, because the science at the time was that disease was caused by miasma, by bad air. And the doctors did not like the implication that they were unclean. They did not like having to wash and change coats. And they definitely didn't like it that females were doing a better job than they were. So it took decades before we found out about microbes. But this is, you know, similarly to what your dad is suffering. Is this true that he doesn't get support from science agencies and stuff?
In the past, it's been really, really bad with institutions leading the ridicule, but it's really starting to change a lot now. And now we have the first university-led hub, and there's a lot more acceptance of it in general. And exactly what you're talking about, he often uses Semmelweis as an example, and he says if you study everything through history with truly new paradigm shifting thinking, that the institutions will be the first to lead the ridicule, and they will not change no matter what. So Semmelweis was exactly what you're saying. He was ridiculed. I think he died in a mental asylum. He literally went nuts because he knew that he was right, but nobody would listen. Well, the institutions wouldn't listen. Nobody would listen. Same with Galileo. I think the church had him up, and he was really in big trouble for just presenting a different paradigm. And I think obviously my dad studied it in great depth, and it's usually taken about 200 years before the public opinion will shift an organization, and then they will change. So like my dad says, he says we don't have 200 years anymore.
No,
we don't have the luxury of time on this one. So
not at all.
how do we break through ahead of that shift, basically?
Well, it's a real fundamental problem, because scientists like to deconstruct things and then look at individual causality. And they think it's the mechanism of a clock, or it's like a widget factory where resources in produces that. And they don't understand that life is organizing, that cells organize into organelles, and organs organize into bodies, and bodies organize into populations or communities and populations and ecosystems, and on and on. And it's all about organizing, so that it isn't, but it's this linear thinking. And we're part of an ecosystem, so we have to think, as you say, holistically, and not just be able to make those connections. And so it's
we have to
technology.
Make the decisions holistically, not just think holistically, because thinking will do nothing. So it's got to be where the decision is made, and that's where everyone's missed it. Is we know we have to think differently, but nobody's realized that the point we're going wrong is at the decision itself. So we can have the best teams of interdisciplinary scientists working on the whole picture, but then they reduce the actual decision to their area of expertise within that.
It's very complicated, because the decision to kill all those elephants to cut down on the grazing pressure, if they had not cut down the elephants and done nothing else, the problem wouldn't have been fixed either. No. It took your dad figuring out the whole system to get,
my dad
get away from linear thinking.
He trained he did a lot of tracking in the war, and he trained the original tracking unit of the Selous Scouts. And I think that's where so much of his observational knowledge came from. It's just crazy. I mean, if you ever alone with my dad in the African bush and go for a walk with him, like, his knowledge is just frightening, and how close he would get us to wild animals, and stuff like that, without them even knowing we were there. And I think that observational power, and my dad used to just go out into the bush and sit and just watch and observe. And I think that's what we've lost with people becoming narrowly trained experts, is we've lost that power of observation. And I think it's also fascination and wanting to know, rather than learning from a book and saying, oh, well, I got a PhD in elephants, but what about the rest of the world that the elephants live in? That kind of thing. And my dad, when they culled those elephants, that was a really, it was a monumental decision. My dad still cries about it to this day. I mean, that government culled 40,000 elephants, and my dad said he proved what he believed, that the elephants were causing the damage. But after the cull, the desertification got far worse, not better. And it was that cull and that monumental mistake that was the only reason he's ended up discovering what he has, because he vowed that day that he would never, ever, ever let it go until he'd put that right and found a
Let,
way to solve it.
let's have a little bit more background on that story for people who are tuning in and don't know the whole picture. Go back a little bit and talk about the elephant cull, what it was supposed to do, and then how what happened in the wake of that.
Okay, so my dad, as a very young scientist, was part of a team with the government that was put in charge of, so he was with the national parks here. And he was part of a team that was put in charge of choosing the areas to set aside as our national parks. And they chose the most biodiverse, pristine, beautiful areas. And they fenced them off. They took the villages out. They took all the people out, protected their animals by fencing them off and removing the people, the native villagers. And over the next few years, they started to see really bad habitat loss. And they decided that it was too many elephants in these areas. And my dad was part of a team of scientists that were put onto doing the research. And they advised the government to cull because there were too many elephants. And they culled over the next few years 40,000 elephants. And the desertification got worse. But what happened was my father was the only person out of an entire government that stood up and said, we've made a massive mistake here. And nobody else said that. And I work with the guys in conservation now to this day that was there in those times, and they still advocate culling. They will not budge from the fact that it's too many elephants. So what my dad then discovered and set out to achieve and prove is it can't be too many elephants because the desertification got worse without them. So then he went back to what's the root cause. And at that time he didn't realize it was reductionist thinking or decision making. But he said, we fenced them off, but the biggest mistake we made was taking out the apex predator. We took man out. We took the native hunting villages who all lived along the riverbanks in those parks and kept the elephants on the move, kept them bunched together, kept them moving. And of course, man is an adult elephant's only predator. So it was a very big thing. And now, of course, these days you've got the big anti-hunting things that won't understand the connection between man being in balance with an ecosystem and the vital need to hunt. I've grown up, I love animals more than anything, but I do also understand that we're part of the ecosystem and we're a really vital part. And when we remove ourselves completely, we're destroying the ecosystem.
And it's just amazing the way he figured out that they had to keep them together and not just have them out browsing around happily, but they had to mush them to keep them tight together so that they would defecate and excrement so much on their food that they couldn't eat the grass. They had to move on. And it was that huge slug that made a big difference to the whole soil ecology underneath that otherwise was dying and rotting and stuff. And then the photographs that he put together of before and after.
Yeah, it's just incredible. So at Dibangombe near Vic Falls, where we've been managed holistically with a management herd of livestock, but amongst the wildlife, the more the biodiversity increases by that herd, the more it attracts the wildlife. So we now have more and more and more wildlife numbers on that area. And of course, we don't have fences or anything, but it's still a hunting area as well. So when the elephants are on that area, they behave naturally. They're much more, it's amazing, their different behavior. They're sort of wild and they're proud. Whereas if you go into national parks, it's kind of like a glorified zoo. And these animals are pissed off with humans and they're sort of, but
humans aren't playing their roles. What's wrong with these humans?
Exactly. It's like you and I think people, they have a massive disrespect of wildlife when they drive around in those cars and they're just standing there and they're kind of like talking and making a noise. And, like when I'm with my kids all the time at Dibangombe and the wild, truly wild. and I feel so safe with my kids. We go for walks, there's lions, there's whatever, I'll take my kids, there's crocodiles, because those animals have a healthy respect for humans. So it's, you don't feel like, I won't take my kids to some of these areas because the animals have got no respect between, there's no respect between the humans or the animals. So it's just, yeah, so it's all about balance, you know, and I love it.
Oh, wait, you got to tell us the story about the pride of lions on top of the blind.
Oh God. My dad, we had some guests at Dibangombe, and my dad left them in there, and we had this one blind, because all the elephants used to come to this one little pool of water that was there all year round. We call it elephant pools. It's my kid's mud bath. And when he came back, the guests were all like shivering in the blind, and there were some lions lying on the top of it.
Yeah.
Sort of just waiting there. And actually it's fascinating, because I had my kids swimming there a few months ago in the water, and there was a lioness just lying watching all of this stuff going on up in the nearby hill. So
what did Allan do to get the lions? Did he do something to get the lions to move on, or did he just sit back and laugh at them?
The one thing my dad did is we have a camp by the river, and he was coming back from a walk, and there was a big male lion just lying watching what was going on in the camp. So my dad snuck up behind it and gave it a big fright. And it took off and so yeah, it's and he plays horrible tricks on people and makes lion noises and really terrifying.
To Robert, something to say. What your point is about how we think, how we overthink, and how we're taught to think in a totally linear fashion. And the other part of our brain, or perhaps even our hearts, have been dismissed and given second rating to these mental structures, and all of the problems that we're seeing right now in these structures that are too big to not fail. They're at the point where they're weighed down by their belief systems and these protocols. There's no room for new information to be in, like the Zen master pouring tea over the cup that keeps overflowing. Your cup is already full. There's nothing more that could be put in here. So perhaps there's a cup emptying exercise that can be done to prepare people to receive new information through innocent perception.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and I love all your analogies. The problem is with institutions is that, you know, most humans these days have such a disconnect from the natural world, and they have such a mechanistic worldview. I mean, even my own aunt absolutely dismisses anything I say, and she says, "No, we're going to solve it with technology. We don't have to worry about anything." I'm like, "Oh well, it's okay because you're in the departure lounge, but what about your grandchildren?" You know?
Yeah.
we really need to have a. I talk to so many people every day. I have a lot of vegans, and I have nothing against personal choice. If you want to be a vegan, but I get attacked for not being a vegan, and I just often get attacked by people that are completely disconnected from just the realities. And don't get me wrong, I don't touch meat from factory farms. I will worry if I run over a stupid insect on a road. You know, that's how bad I am. I'll save ants if they're in the basin. But I'm practical, and I've grown up very much practically. And in Africa, you know what, we really grew up tough from a very, very young age with the harsh realities, I think, of life, of poverty, of desperation, of the harsh realities of nature. We grew up with lions and elephants, and one of my really good friends was paralyzed by a lion when she was 4 years old. You know, she was taken by a lion, and so we grew up having a healthy respect for the balance. Everything eats everything, basically. It's really not very pleasant out there a lot of the time. And my thing is just if it's humane at the end, like their life must be good and then it must be quick. And my kids, they're taught from very young. They get really excited when we're going to have a nice mom before dinner. Sorry, a cow. And I've taken them to watch a cow be slaughtered, and they have no problem with it. Like it is what it is, you know. And I think we've lost that connect from our food. Like people think that. I remember Jamie Oliver, you know, the English cook. Jamie Oliver doing a demonstration. He brought in a steer and he drew in chalk the cuts of meat, and the whole audience went, "Oh!" And he looked at them and said, "Where do you think your meat comes from?"
Yeah, exactly.
So it's a complete disconnect. Everything's in nice little packets. Nothing has a face. So I can understand how that's happened. Like, you know, it's just not reality. So we have to bring back balance and logic and common sense and things like that. And like I said the other day, with our decision making, the more unnatural a product is, or the more unnaturally it's produced. So two things I'll use there are a vegan burger, or whatever it's called, a Beyond Meat burger, or a factory farmed animal. So that's an unnatural product and an unnaturally produced product. And those two things do terrible harm to the environment in pretty much equal measure. Or I would say the more unnatural product even does more. So again, it's just getting back to common sense and at an individual level. But then when we go to organizational level, an organization will lead with the prevailing views of society. And right now, the prevailing views of society is very mechanistic. Latest technology, computers, they'll have all of that in every organization in the world. So yeah, it's definitely up to the public, as in with Semmelweis or Galileo or whatever. Eventually people will come around, and they definitely are, but are we doing it fast enough to influence the change?
I'm getting this strong feeling that this holistic decision making is really a way for us to gently, or maybe not so gently, leave this world of mental constructs and begin to think and see basically much more relationally about the world. So let's talk a little bit more about that, so people watching can get a sense of, you know, how this holistic decision making can really shift us from the reductionist paradigm to a much more complete and holistic integrated view.
Well, basically, and this is what my dad discovered, was the sort of the root of everything. He wrote all the world's problems down: desertification, climate change, droughts, floods, all social breakdown, mass immigration to cities. And he sat in a room with each one on a card around him. And it's amazing. I mean, I've got one of my greatest friends. She's an amazing woman. She works with wild dogs, and she's highly intelligent, but she lacks common sense because she's learned everything so sort of almost like dogmatically, with no actual, I think you stop thinking for yourself and observing, and that's exactly what it is sit and observe. So I teach my kids, don't believe what I tell you, go out and figure it out for yourself. Like don't just accept what I say. I might be wrong. So yeah,
that's a really good point. Yes, go ahead.
No, Zimbabwe. So yeah, when you're talking about the decision making and calling in experts, the problem is the experts are causing more and more damage because they're more and more narrowly trained. So you could have land and you'll call in a livestock expert and a crop expert and a something else expert and a financial expert, and they look at the whole picture, and then they all reduce their decisions to their areas of expertise. So you've immediately lost that whole vision right there. And that's why I keep saying, doesn't matter how holistically you look at the whole picture if you reduce the decision. So we've got to get people understanding that it doesn't matter how holistic your approach is, how holistically you think, how much you look at every single tiny little aspect in that complex web, if you reduce the decision at the point of the decision. So you just basically waste your time. So here in Zimbabwe, they want to build a huge $1 billion dam. So they've brought in a social and cultural expert to check at the implications on that. They've brought in a financial expert. They've brought in an environmental outcomes expert. And they
another dam expert.
Yeah,
to build a dam.
But yeah, so there's no expert on biodiversity and the whole. And there's no decision that's been based on all of those aspects simultaneously. So now if you had the exact same situation, the exact same experts coming in, but you had an overarching whole under management and holistic context, then you take that advice and you say, let me test it. And you test it if it's in line with that context, and if it's going to be socially, culturally, environmentally, and economically sound in both the short and the long term. And then you will know if those experts, some of their advice you might use, some you probably wouldn't. And that's when you know for sure, and you can test. And the other thing we do is when you make a big decision, you automatically assume wrong, so that you can monitor that decision at the weakest point. So if it's financial, you find the weakest financial link, because that will show the first sign of it being a bad decision.
Going off course, yeah.
And with the, so say you are, if you're a game manager, so I deal with a lot of wildlife guys here, and that's my passion, is game management, is if you want to increase impala populations, or you want to decrease locust populations, you find the weakest point in that animal's life cycle, and you either try and stop it there or try and protect it there to know. So you monitor at that weakest point if you're going the right way. So it's financial, it's ecological, and it's social. You look for a social weak link as well.
There's also the practice of adaptive management, which means figuring out two different approaches, and so you can see which one works better, because it's not like it's right or wrong. It's like whatever the answer is has to be tweaked, and because there's going to be stuff you didn't anticipate.
So in holistic management, when you have two ideas, and you don't know which one to use, which one will be better, as soon as you run them through your context checks, the better one will become apparent immediately. No two will ever come out the same.
Right.
So they'll come out immediately. The best decision for you at that time within that complexity will always straight away become apparent. So you don't just, so a lot of people say, I'm not just stopping farming my wheat and doing this. And so you don't have to, it's a weaning process. So it just makes sure that you're always making a better decision. And this year you'll start to make a better decision. Next year you'll be able to, once you increase biodiversity, things start to fall into balance, and it's easier and easier and easier to make those better decisions. Because
you're informed by experience.
Of course. And the key to it all is, if you met our herders of the management herd of livestock, they've now got over 700 livestock, and they walk with those livestock all day. Their knowledge of that land, they don't even have to think about where they have to go. They know where they have to go. They know what they have to do. And it's amazing, because they will look at the ground and they'll say, okay, well, this grass is a bit older, it's a bit thicker, so we have to bunch the cattle tighter and move them slower, or we have to let them spread out a bit. And so, yeah, it's really, I love it. I think it's so fascinating, but it's all observation and really caring. I think, like, genuinely not going out and saying, what do I want to kill or spray today? It's what do I want to grow and nurture today, And if you've got a weed that you think is not good, then there's an imbalance that you have to put right. And slowly but surely it'll come right once the management is right.
I've been involved with some systems, and that's really key, that you let the local person, like the herder, have the flexibility to make decisions and not have to refer back to the general or the cookbook.
Oh no, they're all involved. And that's the thing, the whole under management is every single person is involved in who's involved in the decision making and making decisions has a say in the context. And then those guys are, you know, those are the ones that are on the ground and observing constantly. So those are the ones you get I mean, they're amazing. So those herders, and people they do actually poach them all the time. People who have big herds of livestock all over the place, they come and bribe them and try and take them because they really are like quite incredible.
I want to interject something. I want to call on the man behind the curtain, Stephen J., who's working this entire process from behind the scenes to see, are there people who, yeah, to see who, if there's anybody who has any questions or comments in this last 5 or 10 minutes that we have.
Yes, let's start with Suzanne Watson.
Sorry, with me? No, with the Mr. Taylor put his hand up. Mr. Taylor put his hand up.
Go ahead, Suzanne. Stephen.
No, you carry on. You carry on. You carry on.
Okay, here's my question, and it's going to sound like an unsavory question, but
No pun intended.
I think that I will agree with Sarah, regardless of which way she goes on this. But in asking people to make decisions who are making decisions based on experience versus other people who would make decisions about the same problem based on education, who do you think is probably going to have the better, whose decisions would you have more confidence in?
The one who's using a holistic context.
Is that more likely to be the person who with the experience or the person with the education?
If there was no such thing as holistic decision making, I would say the person with the experience.
As I said, I would tend to agree because you've been talking, people have talked about the brain. You made a statement earlier that said the hardest people to teach are those with who are the highest educated. And I sit here with a PhD. It's not in.
I did look at you when I said that.
Nothing personal.
I noticed you looked at my part of the screen, but
I didn't want you to get offended.
no, I'm not offended at all. I actually agree with you because one of the problems, and this relates to the whole discussion we've been having about science and the way that science is used. It's very rare that the scientists who go out and do the research, who do the original observations of the natural phenomena that, and science doesn't create anything, it discovers things and then uses what it discovers. And the people that go out and discover it then go and teach other people, and those other people make decisions based on what they've been taught, but they were not the people who did the original observations, and they usually don't take the time to go and do observations to back up what they've been taught. And I think, I told my students many times what you just said, don't believe what I say, go and try it for yourself, which is why I built clinics on campus so that my students could get patients in and they could actually try things for themselves to see what worked and what didn't work. So I think it's the observers who become scientists who know the information, but then they teach others, and the others depend on technology to reduce that process of observation down to something that they can manage, that they can hold in their hand, that they can use as a tool to substitute for the hard work and the time of going out and making the natural observations. One of the things that I heard early on in my science education is that when scientists have the hardest problems that scientists have, to try to get help with solutions, they go and look at nature. It's like when the Wright brothers and others wanted to learn to fly, they didn't just keep trying on their own. They went and looked at birds and mosquitoes and things that do fly, see what the characteristics were. But the people after that who learned what they were taught, they didn't go and look at the birds. They said, okay, let's look at the planes and see if we can make the airplanes better, which is part of the problem. I mean, that's an analogy that may or may not apply. But yes, I do agree with pretty much everything I agree with everything you've said. A couple of things I didn't quite understand, but that's my problem, not yours. So thank you for letting me ask the question, and I do agree with your answer.
Thank you, Dale. Yeah, I think you've hit it spot on. My dad, when he was asked by someone interviewing him the other day, they said, "What's your advice?" She was a young ecologist, and he said, "My advice is to be a scientist first and an academic second."
Yes.
And he said, "We've lost the art of being curious and trying to figure things out. You know, we just get told." And my dad actually left university. He just said, I couldn't learn true science in university. I was just being fed the dogma of society.
Exactly.
So he went out and learned, and observed for himself, which I think has made him such an incredible scientist. And people always say to me, "Oh, but you could have, really done well and gone to university." I said, I didn't want to, because I could learn much more by experience and doing in many different aspects of my life. I didn't want to narrow my field. Sure, if you want to be a surgeon or something very specific, then of course, like what you do is just incredible, and you could not have a PhD for what you do. You know what I mean? But when you're dealing with complex natural systems out in nature, I think you've got to be curious. And the original scientists were just farmers that experimented with plants, and I think, I can't remember the figures, but out of like 6 different types of vegetables or weeds, they came up with everything that we have today. And that wasn't scientists that had gone through university, that was people observing the land. So that, I think that's what we need to get back to in agriculture, is people with a genuine knowledge of the land, itself. I feel very much like, I mean, my dad taught me a lot of stuff. Obviously, I pick up his book and I read his book, and I'm like, I don't learn this from a book. I learn this from being out on the land, being with the herders, being with communities, training, teaching. And you guys are teaching me so much. I can't believe, since we started these conversations, how much I'm learning, because it challenges me to simplify, it challenges me to say things different. You give me a different take, because I think I get stale, and so it just inspires and teaches, and it's communicating, and I don't think you ever stop learning, so it's really nice.
Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you so much. And what's great about conversations is you don't know where they're going to go. And that means new things will be learned. The unexpected will happen. So that's the most exciting thing about these conversations, because they're just beginnings. So thank you, Rob. Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, everyone. Dale, Suzanne, Simon, everyone on the call. And thank you, Stephen J., for being the convener behind the scener. We'll see you soon.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.